So again, this one's going to be a bit different than the other ones, because the other ones were like, whenever I was in a conversation, I would scream like, stop, like whenever it would get interesting. And then I would start recording, and then we would just continue the conversation and so on and so forth. So the difference between this one and the other episodes of Product Nerds Uncut, I finally have a name for it, is that we arrange this meeting so that we can talk about the specific topic. However, I'm not prepared, Jack. I have no questions prepared. It's still, like in the other ones, going to be an open conversation. And then we will see where we will get. And the topic of today is the transformation at Doodle. When we started, and we started pretty much at the same time, I think you started 1 month earlier, right? And after that, I started. That was 2017. And then the whole 2 years that we spent together working at Doodle, and the journey, how we actually changed the way we were working. I called it from investor dictated to product led in one of the posts that I shared, but that's a hook. That's the one thing that I learned: when you write a LinkedIn post, you have to have a great hook. So it's made me talk about that. Was it so much investor dictated? I don't know. Maybe it was a mix, but that's normal, I guess. No.
Yeah, definitely. First, yeah, hi, good to catch up, and sort of glad to be on a interesting podcast. I haven't watched all of the other ones, but I have caught pieces of them, and so in that spirit, I've also not prepared any answers, since you have not prepared any questions. So we'll
That's a
see how
perfect
we
preparation.
go. Yeah, maybe just sort of for me, I think when you join a company, you don't really know what you're walking into. So when I was interviewing for the CPO position at Doodle, it was long. I remember, because I live in Zug, and the interviews are in Zurich, like an hour away. It just felt like there was always one more interview. I think I met, everyone on the board, half of the parent company, and all these different people. So you think, well, I should have a pretty good idea of what's going on. But the reality, I think, of any job is, until you actually start, you don't really know where you're at. My previous role had been at a full-on sort of startup, which was extremely chaotic. So I think in my mind, I was kind of like, it will be more, it can't be as bad as that. Not that the startup was bad, but it was a very kind of intense and sort of frenetic period. And so thinking, well, this company's a bit more established, it has a big parent company, things will be different. And of course they were different, but not necessarily, there's no role you walk into and everything's perfect. Otherwise they wouldn't sort of need to hire you in the first place.
Which is super funny, because I had the same expectation. I was like, before that, I was working at a startup that was pretty chaotic as well. And then when I went through the interviews, I actually had the interview with the person who was owning the role of the CPO before you came on board. And then I thought the same, like, it's an established company and it's going to be more stable and more structured, and we can do things. If it's there for a long time, then there will be some space to experiment and see what's the next thing to build, and maybe iterate, and so on and so forth. And then I joined, and then I joined 1 month after you had joined, and the month later, I think it was, or 2 months later, you announced something like, okay, we're going to do something like Startup 2.0. I was like, what's happening? How did that come?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality of Doodle was in a couple of dimensions, and again, this was not obvious till I joined. You mentioned sort of being investor led. I think it had very high investor expectations, but not led in the sense of like that they had a specific plan. So it was pretty open, which I guess is a good thing. Where I really felt it was sort of sales led, but obviously being an ad supported business at the time, it was very much the sort of ad sort of dimension to things. So kind of trying to take that mode where someone says, we need to build this because this is our main source of revenue and we need to grow it. Quite often, especially with those kind of ads, once you've optimized formats, ultimately you're talking about showing more ads and more intrusive ads. And that, I think, can be a little bit of tension with just, we want to build a great product that people love. We don't want to shove an ad in their face. And the reality, it's got a little bit better, but ad tech and the way ads are served is a little bit clunky, especially on mobile and things like that. Even to this day, there are news websites where you're scrolling and suddenly like you're lost because an ad has like popped over, or it's one of those ads that sort of parallax scrolls, but you can no longer scroll because the ad is kind of in the way. So I think all of those problems, because essentially third parties are just pumping content into your site, it's quite hard as a product manager to say, yes, this is the user experience that I want, and this is the user experience that I love, because you no longer fully control it. So I think investor-led is kind of a good way to put it, but more from an expectation perspective. It's like, we want to do something, we want to make more money, but we don't know exactly what that is. The reality is the parent company was very familiar with ads. You know, it's a media company. Most of their other businesses were ad supported. And so this idea that actually we're going to go in a SaaS direction was not really on the radar from the investors. But when I joined and you start digging into the data, and I think you've posted about this somewhere, one of the unique things about Doodle was it sort of philosophically didn't capture data. That was like baked into the DNA of the company from when it was founded. And, you know, as time went by and sort of newer companies come up, and, you know, the internet had moved on, and then sort of the idea of tracking behavior was very much normal. Doodle didn't have any of that, right? So it's like, you kind of walk in the door and you think, this is going to be great. We've got all these users. We can do lots of testing. We can really understand behavior. Let's look at the data. And everyone's sort of looking at you like, we don't really have any. And so that was obviously
I remember that.
a big thing.
Yeah. And even when I asked, like some things were getting tracked, like there were some events that would get fired, like, you know, they would get fired when you click on some buttons in some sort of order, but nobody knew like what it was really tracking. So I remember I spent that time sitting in front of Google Analytics and really clicking stuff to understand what gets fired, like in a tag manager, to see what gets fired when I do what. And oh, okay, that means it must be tracking XYZ, because nobody could answer the question, like, what is this event, right? So
Right.
I remember this time. And then I remember that we had to, or my first task, big task, was to completely redesign, like, no, I'm not a designer, so I would not just design it. So our design colleague would do that. But we also replace the payment system and actually prepare it for making it a SaaS business. So prepare it to manage subscriptions and handle subscriptions, and we did not have it. And then you were saying something like, one thing that we want to avoid is that we have a worse conversion rate, a worse checkout conversion rate, which is obviously normal. You don't want it to crash, right? But I remember sitting there and thinking, how the hell should I make sure that the conversion rate does not get down if I can not even say what the conversion rate is? I remember having these thoughts, like,
Yes.
what is the conversion rate? And I had to dig really, really deep to find out how I can actually set the baseline.
Yeah, and I think just from talking to other people afterwards, like, while Doodle was quite extreme in some ways, I think it's quite normal. You know, we read some Marty Kagan and sort of work in the industry and understand this kind of shift to being outcome driven. And it's like, hallelujah, this solves all the problems, right? This gives everyone the right amount of freedom. We're all aligned around a common goal. This is brilliant. And then you sort of start out, and as many people have discovered, it's quite tricky, right? One being a big part around, do we even have the data? Do we trust the data? Invariably, if you count things, sometimes you can count things in two different ways, right? You'll have some analytics on the front end, and maybe you pull something out of a database and they never match. You're like, what the hell is going on? And you can waste so much time, or spend so much time. It's not really a waste, because you need to get that baseline and you need to trust the data. I think the other challenge that I've thought about quite a lot with being outcome driven is it's not always obvious what your target should be. I think working out the right KPIs is a fairly well understood process. It's sort of mix of an art and a science, but I think, you know, you can find a good metric for what you want to do, especially in these kind of consumer facing apps with a lot of users. But then someone says, well, what should our OKR be? Should we increase it 5%, 10%, or 1,000%? And it's like, we don't really know, because we don't actually know exactly what we're going to do and how much it's going to move the needle. And that's totally fine, but it's a little bit of a tricky conversation to have, especially when you're kind of managing upwards. It's like, how's this going to go? It's like, well, this is our ambitious target, but we have no idea if it's actually ambitious or not, because much harder, I think, to predict in terms of outcomes, what the impact of things will be.
I think one learning that I had from the time when we started to introduce OKRs was actually two learnings. One learning was, for me, you really need the time not only to get into the process and habit of setting up the OKRs, but also to create some sort of baseline that you can work with, because of exactly what you said. Like, we don't know, is 10% a stretch? Is it good? Is it, we simply don't know. And so you spent the first, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 quarters, maybe like a year or something, just to understand your baselines and what is a good rate, what is a stretch goal, what is a good goal, and so on and so forth. I think that was a big learning for me, because I remember we missed, like in my team, we were super crap at meeting the goals that we set ourselves as KRs. That was like really, really bad. And that was the second learning for me, that I remember discussing with you that when we were working on the new products, that I don't see the reason why we need to have OKRs, because we are working with hypotheses anyway. So it's rather thresholds to understand whether we can achieve them, instead of pushing a number to achieve a goal. And that was the second learning that I had, that I felt like it's not, it felt like the next hammer, to hammer on the other nails. I don't know, go hammer it on other nails, but not on mine.
Yeah, I think both those points are really, really important. So I think knowing, whether it's a full transition, as in we had no OKRs before, or whether it's a sort of mini transition, as in we're going to try and be more outcome driven in terms of our KPIs, knowing that it takes a year or more to get sort of good at that, not to do the first iteration, but to actually sort of get it working, is really important, because otherwise you get sort of 6 months in and you give up, right? You're like, oh, we're wasting so much time talking about this thing, let's just build something, right? And I think it might be a Jeff Bezos thing, but he talks about doing handstands. And so most people think you can learn to do a handstand in 2 weeks or whatever it is. And of course, after 2 weeks, you can't. And so those people give up because they thought it would take 2 weeks. The people who actually get good at handstands, headstands, and the people that know, it actually takes 3 to 6 months. And so sort of similarly, I think if you're doing any of these big transitions and you're sort of excited about using OKRs or using kind of more output-driven KPIs, just know it takes a long time to get good at it as individuals, but also as kind of an organization. How you do planning, how you set these targets, whether you have the faintest idea if they're meaningful targets, that all takes time for sure. The other thing, and I think about this a lot, so many teams that I've worked in and so many people I've talked to sort of struggle in a way with OKRs. Not the concept, like we can go read the book, we understand how they're supposed to be written, we understand what a good one is. But and we've certainly had many conversations at Doodle where we were twisting ourselves in knots, like kind of know what we want to do, but we're trying to phrase it this way. And like, is it, have we done this right? And so kind of looking for other things. And then I don't know if you came across this. There's not a lot about this online, but Reforge, they have invented, one of their guys invented NCT, which is Narrative Commitment Task. So the narrative, I think, is super helpful. So even if you're using OKRs, it's like add the narrative, meaning like, why the hell are we doing this? Like, we believe that if we can increase the amount of people who go through onboarding successfully, the stickiness will be X, Y, Z. Whatever that narrative is, I think is almost more important than the actual objective in some ways. So even if you don't go full NCT, adding the narrative, I think it's really interesting. The commitment, as I understand it, is a bit more like the K, right? It's kind of the KPI. And then what I really like actually is the task. So you're not saying, look, this is everything we're going to do to meet this, but invariably, and this is, I think, where OKRs, you get twisted in knots, invariably, you kind of know what you're going to try first, at least you have some idea. So even though you're sort of pushing the outcome-driven narrative, it's not that you have no idea what you're going to do. And so I think it's actually useful to write down, these are the first tasks we're going to do in order to try and meet this commitment. And, there needs to be the understanding as an organization that you might try something, it might not work, and you might end up doing something completely different. But like, if we kind of know what we're going to do, let's write it down, and it helps people understand what you're talking about, and so on and so forth. So,
and at least we have a starting point, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. So whether it's NCT specifically, I think the N and the T are actually useful to work into your process somewhere.
Yeah, agree. I've been trying it out for myself, so not at a point where I could share any learnings, but I'm trying it out for myself in my own business. So, like my service business. So let's see.
Yeah, let us know how it goes.
Yes, I will. But I definitely agree, and maybe that's a point where we could talk about 3 topics in that time. So one topic is roadmaps, which comes from OKRs, NCT, but also the output roadmaps that we work with as well, and our experiments with deadlines versus not deadlines. I think this is pretty interesting to share. The second is what Marty Kagan also preaches, like if you're not able to release latest every second week, fix this first. And you remember when we started, we had this huge monolith, right? So, and maybe we could also talk about that. And the third thing I would like to talk about is like not only that, but in general infrastructure, also data infrastructure and any kind of infrastructure topic. And the third thing maybe is also culture. I think it only worked because we had the culture that people worked together and trusted each other, that we all wanted to, you know, not just work the right way, but actually achieve the right thing. Maybe we could talk about this. Right? Maybe let's start with roadmap. So coming back to OKRs and NCTs, I remember we had lots of conversations. So I don't remember if I mentioned this in the beginning, but so I am looking at the whole topic from a lead product manager perspective, and Jack is looking at the topic from the CPO perspective. So we have different experiences, and so the conversation kind of goes from both experiences. And now that he's not my boss anymore, I can be super open. And
yeah,
let's talk about that. I remember like we had the conversation about, hey, there are things we're trying to achieve. We're setting OKRs now, you know, we're trying to have some meaningful metrics to work towards. But at the same time, dear management, you're telling us to build this and that and deliver this and that by this time. So from our perspective, it was a stretch for us to actually bring all of this together. As in, if we are supposed to move a metric and at the same time, you want to see some specific features or even whole projects delivered by us. So how can we make sure that we deliver on the metric? What's your view on this?
My view has, I think, evolved a lot since Doodle. The topic of roadmaps is super interesting to me because somehow no matter how hard I try it, I feel like I've never been able to completely avoid them. What I would replace a roadmap with, and there are many reasons why this is very difficult, but I was lucky enough to have several experiences after Doodle where I think the light bulb moment for me was actually working at Chat Roulette, a company some of you might know, where we spent an inordinate amount of time, and this is sort of driven by the way that the founder thinks, really trying to figure out what the really important things were and trying to distill that down to like 2 or 3 things, and not features, but like really important things. What makes the whole thing tick? And then you get a shared understanding around that, which is much, much harder than you would think. You can have very long and very deep conversations to really, truly first uncover what really makes your business tick, and then kind of work out what the most important things are. And there might be 2 or 3 things. And then spend as much time as it takes, whether it's your roadmap or just kind of the way the whole team is oriented, working on those things, and everything else kind of becomes noise. And my first reaction when I said out loud is like, wow, it's never that simple, right? There's always noise. We've got to deal with the stuff or it catches up with you. But I think the reality is you have to understand what that kind of really core, what those core fundamentals are. So Doodle had an amazing flywheel, right? The way Doodle works is I'm here, I'm a signed up user, and I'm going to create a scheduling poll. And then I'm going to blast that out to 6, 8, 10, obviously varies, people who are going to participate. And all those people are then exposed to our product. And there's a chance that some of them will convert and obviously want to create their own. So that's sort of a really nice flywheel where they're then creating more and inviting more people. And that's one of the reasons why Doodle kind of grew on its own to 200 million plus users. And then the other really nice thing about that is once you have people regularly creating these scheduling polls, there are features that they're willing to pay for, and that's where your subscription business comes from. So I think we understood that, but we didn't talk about it enough as a company. Like the roadmap is not irrelevant, but basically if everyone is aligned with making that flywheel turn, there's not really, it like makes prioritization much easier, right? And I think it was in the back of our minds, it needed to be in the front. And you asked me about roadmaps, and I realized I'm sort of not answering that. But I think if you as a company really understand that deeply, and spend the time to educate everyone, and then the harder piece for me certainly was then trying to make sure the investors, the board, kind of understood that. In an ideal world, and we never got there, but in an ideal world, everything you do would just make sense because people have this flywheel in mind and they say, okay, you're doing that in order to move this piece of the flywheel, right? And then again, reasons why this is tricky, but no one's saying, what are you doing in Q1 next year? Because they kind of know you're driving the flywheel. That's what you're doing. And those levers, like my experience, if you try hard enough, there's not an infinite number of them. Like as a product manager, it literally, in my whole career, it's always felt like there's 1,000 things going on and 10,000 more that you're ignoring. So the role of the roadmap or that process for me is like, how can we turn down the noise? How can we just make it obvious to ourselves, to everyone in the company, why we're choosing A over B in a way that doesn't require for every prioritization decision that you have to tell a whole story, right? And so I suppose, long story short, get away from roadmaps if you can and replace it with that, replace the time you spend on it, replace the sort of mind share with education about what you're doing and why. And that flows very nicely then into your KPIs. Why are we caring about this and not that? Well, it's one of the levers that drives our business. Big argument against that, and it was partially true at Doodle, but it's more true, especially in sort of B2B environments. It's like, well, we have other activities going on, right? We have a marketing team who need to market this thing. We have a sales team who need to sell this thing. And that's true, but in a way, unless you're putting billboards by the side of the road that have like a 9-month lead time, or doing TV commercials, which is like a year or whatever it is, I think we can actually, in this day and age, be a bit more agile on the sales side and agile on the marketing side, so that if someone says, hey, look, we didn't tell you this was coming because we didn't know ourselves, but we've discovered this great thing, so we've built it and it's working. Now go spend a month building the marketing plan. And so, okay, the marketing plan's 1 month later than it would have been anyway, otherwise, but you're getting there much quicker, because if we'd had to think of it all up front in order to write it on a roadmap to tell you it's coming at that point, it probably would have been a year out on the roadmap anyway. So I don't know if that's clear, but it's kind of like challenging that idea that people need to know what's happening in 3 quarters time.
Totally. And I think these are also the biggest conversations that I have in my coaching conversations. Like, I need to create this roadmap because management expects it, or I don't know, whoever, maybe it's investors who expect to know what's going to happen three quarters in the future, right? So it's exactly this challenging aspect, to be honest. Like, how can you create some sort of distance between a roadmap that is expected from you to be built versus how you really operate the whole company, right?
Yes, definitely. And I think every business is different, but if you just go in with the mindset of like the default is not a roadmap, even if it's now, next, later, that's still, I think, disingenuous, right? Because you don't actually really know most of those things, and replace it with more sort of themes and a deep understanding of what actually makes your business tick. I think you can get away from that kind of roadmap death march. And I would say at Doodle,
I love that.
I would say at Doodle, we didn't get away from it, right? I can say we were not successful. I think as a mindset, we were going in the right direction, but ultimately we had, these kind of fixed milestones and not as much flexibility as we would have liked. I think on a sort of zoomed in level, there were some really good examples of, we had an outcome in mind, the team were free to kind of iterate and try different things and really successful. But on a sort of macro level, we were still quite sort of roadmap top down driven.
Yeah, that's true. And also when you say like milestones, we also had those dates in the roadmap, right? I don't think necessarily that dates are bad. And we ran this experiment. We said we want to try a roadmap without dates. And then we kind of, if you remember, we kind of like all the teams lost their way, if you remember. And yeah, we at one point we felt like we are doing something, but when should we actually finish? I mean, we ended up setting dates ourselves, like as a team, and said like, okay, we want to finish it by that date, because otherwise we're gonna work on it eternally. It's never gonna end, right? So I think even if you move away from roadmaps, I see it as two dimensions of planning. Let's say one is the content of what you're planning, as like, is it themes, and then you break it down and somehow come up with this content. Like maybe you start with an overall picture with the mission, or I don't know, with the business goals and the flywheel, whatever is important, and then you come to the point where you say, we will work on this and this and this and that. Maybe it's NCTs or whatever. And the second dimension is still time, I think. I think we cannot work decoupled from time, because we live in sequences. So time is not, well, okay, quantum physics, right? But, we're not there yet.
We'll park that one for now. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think even as an engineering
You're
team,
mute,
it's
I
like,
think.
look, the way we...
Can't hear you. Is it me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so
Cool.
all right. But let's maybe move on to the other topic about infrastructure. When we started, we were not in a place where we would be able to deliver frequently. Would you like to talk about that first, or would you want me to talk about that from my perspective?
I think we probably have a similar perspective. So yeah, do you want to go first?
From my perspective, it was necessary to do something about it. I don't know. I find it a very difficult decision to say either, like, you cannot stop the whole production and then change the whole infrastructure, and then you have a production stop for like what, a year or whatever, while doing like bits and pieces maybe on the front end, and especially not if you're trying to move the whole business model from mainly ads driven to subscription driven. You have to keep delivering user-face stuff, but at the same time, when you say like we change the pieces that we touch and we do it step by step, it just becomes a very long and painful surgery. And this is how it felt from the lead product manager perspective. It was a painful surgery. Like even in our team where we were pretty much decoupled from old tech, let's say from legacy, because we were building this stuff, new code, we were still we still had this dependency to the legacy Doodle part, and we had all those APIs that should actually make sure we don't suffer too much from that, but it still didn't work. Like I remember the time when we had launched, I think it was Bookable Calendar, and then like for a month or so, nobody was able to book, and we spent a whole month just to understand what's happening, to then see that somewhere in the legacy code, one single piece was changed that was very important for the API that would talk or that would keep legacy and new code in sync. And it was just one single piece of it. And so I don't know what a solution is. I just think that people need to be aware how careful they need to be when they do this kind of long and painful surgery. So I think it's just that, because you cannot really stop everything and just rebuild everything. And everything in that case was like 16-year-old code, right?
Yeah, it was quite extreme, and I think
And there was
I
a lot of
remember there were just
frustration.
certain things. If you asked for a feature in certain areas, like no one would say it out loud, but people, like were afraid to touch it because no one really knew what was going to happen, and that's obviously a tricky place to be in. Yeah, I think it drove a lot of the difficulties later on. So if I think about the managing up angle, we probably didn't do a particularly good job of explaining why things were so difficult, and then the expectations that mismatched. So I think, there was always this sense that we could do small experiments and kind of optimize the subscription business with incredible traction, right? Because so little had been done. We could really, move the needle, double the revenue in a year, this kind of thing. I remember at some point we were growing sort of 12% a month, and it's like, why is it not 15? It's like 12 is pretty good for a 10-year-old product, right? And I think where that sort of disconnect happened was, myself included, and this is a big learning for me, is that as you get a little bit sucked into the day-to-day, which as a leader is helpful up to a point, and then it's not helpful, if you know what I mean. I think I was kind of I was sort of optimizing the product strategy based on what I knew we could do, because I knew we couldn't do a lot quickly because of all this work. Like more than half the team were working on this, but also certain things, there's no point building a feature here because we're going to remove it next week, and rebuild it. And so it was kind of dictating some of the roadmap. And so I think the product strategy lost its ambition to some extent because because of reality, right? And you say, well, maybe that's okay, but it ultimately, I think, it meant we were doing the right things in the short term, but I think not kind of doing enough to talk about what we could do in the long run. And it almost felt, and this was subconscious, but I'm more aware of it now, it sort of felt like, well, if we can't even do this now, there's no point talking about this other thing in the future. But I think the reality, especially with the growing companies, you do need that sort of stronger sense of the future, even if people doing the work know that there are some pretty large obstacles before you get there. So that's one thing. The other thing, I 100% agree with you. I think you have no choice but to kind of tackle it. And then it's more of an expectation management and more of a kind of spending a bit more time making sure we really understand it, a bit like back to the handstand thing, right? The reality, and this happens a lot, and I think it's probably a big difference between companies that ultimately hit things out of the park and companies that just sort of do okay, is like, if you come and you say, hey, look, this is a 3-year undertaking and it's going to cost this much money, and while we're doing it, we can do so much less of all this other stuff. It just doesn't get approved. So consciously or otherwise, we then become optimistic and we're like, well, if we do this and we compromise on that, maybe we'll buy this feature, buy this underlying tech in, we could do it in 6 months, because that's the only way to get it approved and moving forward. And then obviously 6 months later, you have to then sort of on the back foot tell the story why it's taking longer, and there are always good reasons, right? And eventually it takes 3 years. And the reality is, if you just knew up front that's how long it was going to take, it would have been much smoother. It would have been, better in every dimension, and the company would be in a much better place. But you just can't sell that, so you get stuck, right?
So what's the solution here? Basically, selling the it's going to be cool and fast and so on and so forth, but planning for the long term, or what would be your suggestion?
I think on reflection, it comes a little bit back to this, like really understanding the levers and talking about them constantly and making sure everyone really understands them, because we all know as product managers that we want to build lots of features, but actually half of them, I think the stats say much more than half of them don't actually help in any way, right? Like if you think of something like a very simple A/B test, we can't even predict the outcome of whether having a bigger button will help or not, right? And you think, I've been doing this 20 years, of course I know. But of course you don't, right? So the idea that you could then actually predict, well, what's the impact of this feature going to be? We're 100% sure, let's just go build it, is obviously nonsense. So I think it's a couple of things. One, getting back to that core of like, what are we really about? Do we have the right strategy? Do we understand the levers? And then you need much less features, right? Just make sure the ones that you build are the right ones. And there's obviously a lot that goes into doing that. I think at Doodle, we were going in the right direction, but should have spent more time on discovery, more time on prototyping, more time on sort of low fidelity stuff, and make sure that, the stuff that comes ultimately to the engineering team as like, go gold plate this, was, a subset of everything. And that helps take the pressure off, right? Because if a lot of your team is busy doing necessary kind of tech debt re-architecting work, then let's make sure the features we do build really land with users, but also drive whatever the key bits of our business are. Which sounds very simple.
Yeah, no, but it's a good point. It's again this thing of take a different perspective, like think out of the box. It's not about trying to optimize the way how you work, but it's more about like working in a completely different way and with different mindsets. And when you say, it actually totally makes sense, right? When you say, take a step back, think about what's really important, and make sure everybody works only on the most important stuff, then it necessarily means you have to do more discovery. Also on the side of, I think we did a lot of discovery on the to reduce the usability risk and feasibility risk, and potentially viability as well, but not necessarily the value aspect, right? So do users really want to use this? And in that sense, the combination with viability, do they want to use this so much so that they would pay for it? I think we lacked on this part of it. And I think with what you say, it makes totally sense, so that you would have to have a setup that makes sure that we really only build whatever users want in a way that it helps the business or achieve business goals. And then if you look at it from that point, maybe the whole restructuring, rebuilding everything is not as painful as it is usually if you're still trying to deliver on new features.
Yeah, and I think part of what makes it painful is you don't quite have enough resources and mind share to do those sort of rebuild correctly. You don't quite have enough resources and mind share. You're always trying to sort of squeeze as much in as possible. It's a later revelation for me. It's actually counterproductive, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not the first person to talk about focus, but it's become more and more apparent to me that that really is the key to everything. And it's like, whatever the conversation, like, it seems like we have too much to do, let's cut here. It's like, let's just keep going in this conversation. What else is not really necessary? What else is not really there? Why does it feel like there's 10 things going on? We've sort of accepted it, but maybe there's a way to like really focus in the short term, so that we do, the classic, let's do 2 things well rather than 10 things badly, but just taking that really to heart across the whole organization.
And this might even open up the mind space for looking into the future at the same time, right? Thinking about the future at the same time instead of always. Yeah. Which brings me to the topic of culture, because I think, so yes, it was painful. And yeah, there were many conversations going on, but at the same time, as negative some conversations were, they were also positive because people were bought in. They knew why they would do it. And it felt like we are a team and we're doing this all together. We're helping each other and we're supporting each other because we want this future. We want to get there that we can release frequently. We want to get there that we are not afraid of touching a part of the system. We want to get there that we can release either new features or iterations. It doesn't matter, like changes in the product much faster, so that our users get exposed to this much faster than we can deliver today. And everybody was aligned on this mission that we want to restructure things in a way that we can deliver value to users faster. And then also the way we were working from the product trio, let me put it into quotes, because we were like in the teams, I think our strength was that PM and design were working very well together, like partners in crime. And we were looking for a technical component in this partner of crime thing. And if you remember, I insisted on having one lead tech lead who would join those conversations and be like full into the whole discovery aspect as well, into those conversations. And I think we were also bought into the idea that we want to understand if we should build something before we build it. We were running like small experiments all the time, not only in our team, like the other teams as well. All of us were doing that. And I think if you're going through a transition, and it took us 2 years to get to a, as I call it, junior product-led organization, we were fully aligned that we really want to do this. And we also invested into that ourselves, like personally. We went to those conferences. I think actually you kicked it off with the workshop that we went to in Barcelona, where we learned about lean product management by Itamar Gillard and Jeff Goffeld in their workshop. And then we went back and tried to apply those things. And in the offsite, we were doing exercises that that you introduced us to, like the press release, Amazon's press release and this kind of things. And I think this kicked off the mindset shift and made sure that we were all aligned that this is the way we want to work. And I think if you don't have this culture and this alignment in the company that people really want to work this way, it can take much longer and can be way more painful to get there. It's my opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, 100%. And I think still to this day, it's probably the thing that I'm most proud of in a work context, which is just imagining the team, the product team, but also the product design, but also sort of the engineering component, where we started to where we ended up. And we all know that sort of culture change, mindset shifts are really, really difficult. So to be able to successfully go from a kind of very reactive, the sales guy asked for this, let's write a ticket, put it at the top of the backlog, my life's easy, let's move on, to sort of the product led, if you want to call it that, but to the mindset of like, yes, I as a product manager are going to really deeply understand the sort of the customer, the viability for the business, and work, you know, closely with design and product, test these things out, work out what hypotheses are actually worth testing, figure out how we're going to test them, and then see the results. So, you know, we sort of touched on it. It wasn't universally there, but on a sort of zoomed in level, like there were so many times where the team would take the outcome, take the goal and kind of iterate on it. I remember, you know, one goal was, again, thinking about this flywheel, increase the rate of participation, right? So I've sent this thing out, no one replied, that's a problem. And it's quite a nice problem to solve. And I definitely had some ideas in my mind, how I might solve it. But then a couple of the teams took this on and came up with completely different things that were, you know, obviously 10x better than anything I had in mind. And so I think that for me was very satisfying to go from kind of almost one extreme to going in a good way, but also then it wasn't just theatre, right? We really saw concrete results where we were more innovative. We did drive better results for the user, better results for the business. And so, yeah, I think you touched on some of those points. And actually a useful reminder for me is like, how did we do that, right? Hiring the right people. So I guess I've been lucky enough in my career to do a lot of hiring. And there's kind of an interesting problem where it's really hard to know if someone's good for a role. There's all these different theories that fundamentally interviewing is not a great way. Actually, it's the best we got, but it's not necessarily the perfect. So spending a lot of time both hiring people, but then also having enough time to see how they panned out, right? Because quite often you leave the role before you really know. So I've been lucky in a couple of roles to be able to do that. So I think getting good at hiring while it's not, there's no silver bullet, is extremely important. Onboarding, I think we got better at onboarding, but if I were to change anything when I came into a growing org, it would be focus on onboarding first, because that's really your chance to instill a mindset, right? The new people, they obviously have their own way, which is great. You want to incorporate that, but ultimately saying, look, this is how we think, this is how we do things. These are the product principles that we follow. It's much easier then than waiting 2 years and then trying to sort of retrofit it in. The offsites I really enjoyed. On reflection, some of my favorite times. So it's 3-4 times a year, take the whole team somewhere neutral, so to say, spend time getting to know each other, spend time on concrete problems, spend time on sort of more abstract problems. And I think now, you know, this was pre-pandemic. Now that remote work is more common and hybrid work is more common, that model actually works even better, right? Like, don't insist I come to the office every day, but make sure once a quarter, all of my colleagues, we can get together and really have the headspace to talk, which was really, really cool. So yeah, I think lots of elements. You mentioned Itamar and Jeff. That was, for me, I've been on various product learning courses. That's the only one, if I'm honest, where I'm like, yes, we think the same way, send the whole team. If everyone can learn from these guys, then we're in a good place.
And we continued sending the new people to them, right? So
exactly,
we continued doing that. Yeah.
And
I still send everybody to Itamar's course, so I still do that.
Exactly. It's just a nice, I think, articulation of what we sort of all have an intuitive sense of, but we don't know how to implement, right? It's like concretely, if you want to work iteratively, you want to bake in discovery, if you want to be outcome driven, we will agree on that. Now I need to go on this course to actually understand how I do that, right? So it's really, really cool.
Cool. It was a great conversation. I mentioned in the beginning I would stop at 30 minutes, but I didn't.
I just looked at the clock. I was like, oh yeah, too much talking.
Yeah, we were a bit over time, but I really enjoyed it. So and I hope that there was lots of pieces that others who want to go or have to go, I don't know, along the same journey or a similar journey. There are bits and pieces that they can take with them to learn from. Oh, there's one thing that I wanted to mention, actually, cross-functional teams, right? I think so of course this is kind of basic now, of course, working cross-functional teams and so on and so forth. I just believe another learning that I had is that cross-functional can and should also be thought in a broader way. For example, at one point, we tried to integrate product marketing into our cross-functional team. We experimented with that, right? So don't get too much into dogmatic conversations, try things out. And we tried it out to integrate them as a fixed part of the team and figured, okay, it has value that he's part of the team, but not as a fixed part of the team who always spends the time with us. So we made sure that they're always integrated into our work. At the same time, cross-functional can also be in the functional team, as in I personally found a lot of value that not only product and design was reporting to you, but also customer support and the whole data team were reporting to you as well. And I found it very, very good because this way we have the whole end-to-end experience of a user who comes to the platform, uses the product, and then reaches out again because of either good or bad things that happen. And I really like that. And yeah, that was an enabler, I think. So.
Yeah, it's nice to hear you say that, because I definitely believe that as well. And it's not about trying to put your arms around the biggest pie, but it's really about, there should be no silos here, and that's one way of achieving it. So.
Yeah. Right. So then, thank you very much for the half spontaneity. I mean, yes, this was scheduled, but the spontaneity part was that neither of us were prepared, and it just had to be a conversation, and that's how it goes with the other episodes as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Really good to sort of hear your thoughts and your perspective, and also it's always nice to share as well.
And for everyone else, if you want to know more or details or have other questions, reach out to Jack. He knows the details. All right. So thanks a lot. I will click the stop button. Where is it? There. Edit. I just said something because Jack said something, and I think you guys need to hear it. We're just talking about the point that it's we might have taken it for granted that we worked so well together, but it's actually not to be taken for granted. It's not necessarily normal in every company. And Jack mentioned, as kind as he is, it has nothing to do with me, but it has something to do with him and the whole management, because they set the North Star that we want to work in a different way without saying that we want to work in a different way, which is super difficult to do. Because I don't know how you feel, Jack, but I always felt like when management stays, I don't know, has this team event or all hands or whatever, and then they are celebrating I mean, celebrating wins is nice, but like in a way that it sounds so salesy. And now we want to show you how great you are, and you were part of this whole change. And so it's not genuine. It doesn't feel they mean it. It just feels they're playing it. And you guys did not do it. You guys said like, look, we can either go this way or we can go that way. We don't think that this way is a good way. So we believe this way is a good way. And we hope that you guys see that as well. So what we're going to change is da 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 da. And it was like, for us, it was like, yeah, of course this way is the bad way. Of course we want to go that way, right? And you made it in a way that it felt genuine, and it really gave this intrinsic motivation to be hands-on and drive that change. And I think this is very difficult to do. And therefore, yes, you did a great job. Like you as a whole team did a great job on doing this part. Just to share learning.
No, it's good to hear. I mean, I think sort of a side note on that, something I think about a lot is specifically around the role of a product manager. That because everyone, you might have 5 other peers who are doing the same job, but actually you don't always have a direct reason to talk to each other, right? You spend a lot of time in your cross-functional team, spend time with your manager, you have a weekly team meeting or something like that. But actually there are people in the org who are experiencing the same thing, having some of the same challenges, managing it in their own way. And it seems in my head like by default you guys should just find each other and chat. But it's become apparent to me then that you do actually have to encourage it. You do have to give people a reason to sort of talk across what are essentially small silos, right? Each cross-functional team. And it's not about having a big planning meeting once a year or once a quarter. It's a lot more than that, I think.
It's a daily interaction, right? Cool, thank you. Just wanted to record this part as well because I think this is important.